Hey there everybody, welcome back to the channel. So today I'm continuing my set review for Phyrexia All Will Be One, and today we are diving into the blue cards. It'd be the Surgical Bay sphere of Phyrexia as we get closer to the core of that plane, and it's been pretty fun so far. Looks like the set's shaping up to be pretty nasty. Seems like everything in Phyrexia bites or sticks you or infects you or makes you sick or something like that. I mean, you can't even breathe the air, so it's pretty wild. But we're going to dive into the blue cards today, so let's just go ahead and get into it and start checking out the cards. First up, we're going to start with the commons, and our first common is Aspirant's Ascent for 1 blue. It's an instant, and it reads, until end of turn, target creature gets +1/+3 and gains flying and toxic 1. Interesting card. It actually looks like it has both an offense and defensive uses for it. The defensive use would be a surprise ability to give your creature flying if your opponent's trying to fly over with something and be able to block, giving it +1/+3. Offensively, you could use it to give one of your creatures flying to fly over and nail them, and give your opponents a poison counter, which could be useful to get in some of the final poison damage or poison counters for your opponents to finish them off. However, it is situational and isn't useful all the time, so I think I'm going to go ahead and just give it a I'm going to go ahead and give it a low rating for limited, and I think we'll do the same for constructed. Don't see it getting much use in constructed for the most part, unless you're playing a dedicated poison deck, but most of the time you're going to see it being used in limited, and on that occasion it'll be every once in a while. So yeah, I think we'll just go low across the board for limited and constructed for the Aspirant's Ascent. Next card is Bring the Ending for 1 and a blue. It's an instant. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 2, and it reads Corrupted. Counter that spell instead if its controller has 3 or more poison counters. So this card, it's okay with its initial requirement for your opponents to resolve their spell, where they have to pay 2. It's good in the early game. However, if you're playing a deck that uses a lot of poison to put on your opponents, it's going to be most powerful in that kind of deck. I could see it being pretty solid in that kind of deck. That being said, it's hard to say. I think it's going to do better in limited, just due to the fact that you might be able to do some draft or sealed decks that are dedicated to poison counters, and you might have an easier time getting them on your opponents. That way it could be a hard counter for just 2 mana. That's pretty solid. However, I think that could be harder to pull off in constructed. I want to say I'm going to give it a mid rating for limited. It's right on that border between low and mid, but for constructed, I don't see it happening that often, just due to the fact that your opponents most of the time are going to have ways to pay for the 2 mana in the game, and I think it'll be a little harder for them to get poison counters, because your opponents are going to be aware of your strategy once they see what you're trying to do. And there's still in constructed, there are some other decent counter spells that you can use for 2 mana. So we'll go mid for limited and low for constructed. Our next card is Chrome Prowler for 2 and a blue. It's an artifact creature, a Phyrexian cat, 3/2 power and toughness. It has flash, and when Chrome Prowler enters the battlefield, tap target creature an opponent controls. Yeah, I think this is a decent card. The fact that it has flash and it can tap your opponent's creatures, this is a good way to flash it in at the end of your opponent's turn, tapping down one of their potential blockers, leaving the way open for you to attack, maybe unimpeded on your turn. So I think that's pretty decent for limited. I'm going to go ahead and give it a mid rating for limited. Constructed, I think it's a card that probably won't see much play, maybe in Commander or a Phyrexian deck or a cat deck, but beyond that, probably not too often. Maybe a flash deck, but I think low is probably pretty accurate for constructed. So we'll go mid and low for the Chrome Prowler. Our next common is Escaped Experiment for 1 and a blue. It's an artifact creature, Phyrexian Beast, 2/1 power and toughness. Whenever Escaped Experiment attacks, target creature an opponent controls gets -X, -0 until end of turn, where X is the number of artifacts you control. So for this to really be useful, you're going to be needing to use quite a few artifacts. This actually could work in a Might deck because Mites are going to be running around and they are artifact creatures, so that could help you. And if you attack, one of your creatures pretty much just loses their ability to deal any damage to any of your creatures. So it's not bad. However, it is kind of flimsy with its low toughness rating. So it's a good 2-drop, but like I said, for it to really be useful, it's going to need to be in a high count artifact deck. I think I'm going to give it a low rating for limited. Same thing for constructed. Just not something I see being used in constructed that much. Probably more so in limited as just a body to use to attack your opponents. But beyond that, it's kind of a foot soldier that will probably get killed early on. But it is an artifact, and that might help you with some artifact triggers when you're playing. So, but for now, I think I'll probably go low across the board for it. Our next card is Experimental Augury. It's an instant for 1 and a blue. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order, and then proliferate. So basically this is Anticipate with a proliferate stapled onto it. That's pretty solid. If those of you are familiar with the Anticipate card, it's pretty much does exactly the same thing minus the proliferate. I like it. I think it's a solid card filter. It lets you get a card, put it in your hand so that it replaces itself, and you get to select it from 3 cards, and then you just put those in the bottom in any order. Solid card. It's a non-creature spell, so that could help in some of your non-creature triggers, and it also gets you a card and helps you sift through your deck a little bit. So I'll go mid for limited. I think I'll do the same thing for constructed. I think this will see some constructed play, especially in some proliferate decks. It could be pretty solid. So mid across the board for Experimental Augury. Our next card is Eye of Malcator for 2 and a blue. It's an artifact. When Eye of Malcator enters the battlefield, scry 2. That's cool. And then whenever another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, Eye of Malcator becomes a 4/4 Phyrexian Eye artifact creature until end of turn. I think that's it's not bad. You probably get several triggers off of this if you're playing Mites or you have other artifact creatures or just artifacts in general. It's kind of like a sleeping artifact that when it enters the battlefield, you can scry 2. So it's not bad. It's going to be a build around card, I think, though. Because of that, it's kind of tough. I think I'm going to give it a low rating for limited. However, if you're building around it with artifacts, it might be worthy of a mid rating. Same thing for constructed. I think there's something that you're going to need to be playing dedicated artifacts, almost entirely artifacts, to get this to trigger quite a bit. So, other than that, it's probably not going to be used that often in constructed. So we'll go low across the board for Eye of Malcator. Next card is Gitaxian Anatomist for 3 and a blue. It's a creature, Phyrexian Wizard, 2/5 power and toughness. When Gitaxian Anatomist enters the battlefield, you may tap it. If you do, proliferate. I think this might be situational. There's going to be times that you need to proliferate, and this would be a good way to do it. And of course, the drawback is you have to tap it. But there's going to be other times that when it enters the battlefield, you don't want to tap it, and you need a solid blocker. And it's pretty decent at 2/5. I think, though, I think there might be better ways to proliferate, though. So I think I'm going to give it a low rating for limited, and definitely for constructed. There's just other better options at 4 mana and being able to proliferate. It'll definitely be something you'd want to use in your proliferate deck, but it would probably just be occupying a slot because you don't have anything better. And it is kind of expensive at 4 mana. So I think we'll just go low across the board for the Gitaxian Anatomist. Our next card is Gitaxian Raptor for 2 and a blue. It's a creature, Phyrexian Bird, and it's a 1/4 power and toughness. It has flying. Gitaxian Raptor enters the battlefield with 3 oil counters on it. And you can remove an oil counter from Gitaxian Raptor. Gitaxian Raptor gets +1/-1 until end of turn. Interesting. So I think this is our first blue card using oil counters. And as we saw in red and green, oil is going to be a big thing. And if you remove 3 from it, you could actually hit your opponent for 4 points of damage with it right off the bat if you wanted to. It's also a decent blocker with a 4 toughness. And it's a flyer, so it's got evasion. That means you might be able to equip it with something or give it some other kind of benefit. I actually kind of like it. I'm going to give it a mid rating for limited. I think this could have some decent uses to it. And there are other ways to get oil counters on creatures, so you might be able to pump it up big time, or continuously use its activated ability by removing oil counters. In constructed, unless you're playing a dedicated oil deck, I really don't see it getting much use. Unless you're playing birds or something Phyrexian-like or something like that. But I think it'll shine mostly in limited. So we'll go mid for limited and low for constructed. Our next card is Glistener Seer for 1 blue. Creature Phyrexian Advisor, 0/3 power and toughness. Glistener Seer enters the battlefield with 3 oil counters on it. And you can tap it to remove an oil counter from Glistener Seer to scry 1. Interesting. 0/3. That might be useful for stopping some of your opponent's early threats, and then you can remove oil counters at the end of turn, maybe to scry 1 and help you with your draws. It could be a useful card. However, it's probably not something that's going to factor into my deck all the time, and might be something you bring in from the sideboard. However, if you're playing in a dedicated oil deck, this might help because you could probably use its oil counters for other things other than its own activated ability. That being said, I think I'm just going to give it a low rating for limited. I think it has its uses, but its range is limited, so I think low is pretty accurate for it. And same thing for constructed. Don't think it'll see much play in constructed, but we'll see how it goes in limited. It might be worthy of a mid rating once we see it in play, so we'll have to find out. So low across the board for the Glistener Seer. Our next common is Ichor Synthesizer for 1 and a blue. It's a creature, Phyrexian Wizard, 1/3 power and toughness. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on Ichor Synthesizer, and as long as Ichor Synthesizer has 4 or more oil counters on it, it gets +2/+0 and can't be blocked. So it becomes a 3/3 unblockable. That's pretty good. And so it gets oil counters based off of non-creature spell triggers. That's pretty good. And I just have to get 4 oil counters on it. The only thing is it doesn't come into play with any oil counters, so that's kind of a drawback. But yeah, I actually kind of like it. It's an early blocker, and it does have a 1 power and 3 toughness, so that could block any 1/1s or 2/2s and still live to fight on. And then once you're resolving non-creature spells, this is just going to help it, and you get those 4, it becomes a 3/3 unblockable. So I'm going to give it a mid rating for limited. For constructed, I think we'll stick with a low rating for it and leave it at that for constructed, but I think it might be pretty decent and limited. Next card is Malcator's Watcher for 1 and a blue. It's an artifact creature, Phyrexian drone, 1/1 power and toughness. It has flying and vigilance, and when Malcator's Watcher dies, draw a card. Interesting. This could probably actually work, since it's an artifact, it could actually work with a lot of artifact triggers and death triggers, and you can get be able to draw a card from that. And the fact that it has flying and vigilance, that's pretty decent, so you can get some free attacks in, if you will, if you want to call it that, without having to tap it. I like it. I actually think I'm going to give it a mid rating for limited, and for constructed, we'll go low. In a dedicated sacrifice or artifact deck, I think it could be pretty solid. Might be worthy of a mid rating, but I like it at low for constructed. Mid, I think it could pretty well shine. If you're able to equip it with something too, this could get pretty crazy. So we'll go mid rating for Malcator's Watcher. That's a lot to say. For limited. Next card is Meldweb Curator for 3 and a blue. It's a creature, Phyrexian Wizard, 3/4 power and toughness. When Meldweb Curator enters the battlefield, put up to 1 target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on top of your library. Interesting. I think this probably really work well in the non-creature spell deck. This is a way for you to get one of those back. and be able to draw it. It's a decent size, 3/4 power and toughness. I think I'll probably give it a mid rating. It's something I would definitely have in my deck if I'm playing the non-creature spell strategy. And it's got a decent enough size of a body to be useful. Probably go low for constructed. There's just going to be other options to choose from at the 4-drop slot. But still, you know, maybe in a commander deck, it's useful for helping you get one of your instants or sorceries back, especially in commander, since a lot of those use some really cool instants and sorceries. So we'll go mid for limited and low for constructed. The next common is Meldweb Strider for 4 and a blue. It's an artifact vehicle, 5/5 power and toughness. It has vigilance. Meldweb Strider enters the battlefield with an oil counter on it. You can remove an oil counter from Meldweb Strider. It becomes an artifact creature until end of turn, and it has a crew cost of 3. That's pretty good. And if you can find ways to get more oil counters on it, this thing is going to be pretty solid. The fact that it's 5/5 vigilance, pretty decent. The only drawback is it is a little expensive for a vehicle, so that's kind of tough. I'm going to give it a mid rating for limited, though. I think it might see more play in limited. For constructed, low. It's just too expensive for something like that in constructed. But in limited, it could be a curve topper, and if you're playing an oil deck, this thing is just going to clean house. You don't have to worry about crewing it because it becomes an artifact creature, and you just keep attacking for 5 all the time. Plus, you're still able to retain it as a blocker. And that's when you might want to crew. Who knows? But yeah, I think it will go mid for limited and low for constructed. Next card is Mesmerizing Dose for 1 and 2 blue. It's an enchantment aura. Enchant creature. When Mesmerizing Dose enters the battlefield, tap enchanted creature, then proliferate. Enchanted creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. So this is pretty solid blue removal spell, and it takes out a creature and it lets you proliferate, and it just freezes your opponent's creature. So I like it for limited. We'll go mid. Constructed, I think it will go low as well. Unless you're playing in a proliferate deck, then it might be worth it as a mid-range card. But yeah, once again, we're hitting that mid for limited and low for constructed. But blue seems to have some pretty decent common cards that are worthy of a mid rating. Our next card is Prologue to Phyrexia. For 1 and a blue, it's an instant. Each opponent gets a poison counter, and then you draw a card. Yeah, that's solid. This will definitely work in the non-creature spell instant sorcery strategy. I like it. I'm going to give it a mid rating again for limited. And constructed, actually, I'm sorry, constructed, I give it a mid rating for constructed as well, because it's a card draw engine. This could help you a lot in some of the constructed instant sorcery cards. Plus, it makes your opponents get a poison counter. And if you're playing dedicated poison, this is a way to do it. Who knows? You might have some triggers where your opponents get poison counters based off non-creature spells you cast. Plus, this card, when it resolves, it also gives a poison counter. So, decent strategy. So we'll go mid for both ratings for the Prologue to Phyrexia. Next common is Quicksilver Fisher for 3 and 2 blue. It's a creature Phyrexian Drake, 4/3 power and toughness with flying. And when Quicksilver Fisher enters the battlefield, draw a card, then discard a card. Yeah, I like this. I think it's solid. We'll once again give it a mid rating for limited. I think at 5 mana, 4/3 power and toughness, flying, and then it lets you loot. That's pretty decent. So we'll go. I think it's worthy of a solid mid rating. Constructed, go low on that, and at 5 mana, it's just not something that'll see much play in constructed unless you're maybe playing commander in a dedicated flying or Phyrexian deck, but couldn't see it being used much beyond that in constructed. Our next common is Vivisurgeon's Insight for 3 and 2 blue. It's a sorcery. You draw 3 cards and proliferate. Not bad. A little pricey. I think I'm going to have to go low on both limited and constructed. Yeah, you draw 3 cards and you're able to proliferate, but it is a little slow. You have to pay 5 mana. And a lot of times those card draw spells where you have to pay that kind of cost, usually when they're the best is when they're instants. So you're basically taking a turn off to draw 3 cards, but you are able to proliferate. So, but I think I feel comfortable going low for both limited and constructed for Vivisurgeon's Insight. Moving on to the Uncommons. Our first one is Atmosphere Surgeon for 1 and a blue. It's a creature, Phyrexian wizard, 2/1 power and toughness. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on Atmosphere Surgeon. And then you can remove an oil counter from Atmosphere Surgeon. Target creature gains flying until end of turn, activate only as a sorcery. Interesting. This is actually it's good for an offensive capability for getting these using the oil counters. The reason why is you can only activate as a sorcery, so it kind of helps your force be able to go over the top against your opponents. I like it. I'm going to give it a mid rating for limited. I think it's going to have some good use with all this oil flying around, oil counters, and being able to remove it to give a target creature flying. I think that helps out a lot. And I think that'll help you win some games, get some damage in against your opponents, some chip damage, and maybe some poison counters on them. So, yeah, I think mid for limited is good for the Atmosphere Surgeon. And I think I'll go low for constructed. It's a pretty fragile creature, so could die. I maybe could see it in play in a few decks, different deck types, but overall, I don't think it's going to see too much play in the constructed format at the moment. Our next card is Distorted Curiosity. For 2 and a blue, it's a sorcery, and it says Corrupted. This spell costs 2 less to cast if an opponent has 3 or more poison counters, and then you draw 2 cards. So for Corrupted, that's pretty much anytime your opponents have 3 or more poison counters, they're essentially considered corrupted. And it offers a discount for this spell as a sorcery. It's not bad. I mean, it's pretty much a divination without the corrupted part, and you would end up just drawing 2 cards. But if they are corrupted, then you actually get a 1 mana spell to draw 2 cards. I think that's pretty solid. And it's a non-creature spell. It's something you can use in the Spells Matter decks and the non-creature spell decks. So I think that can help out quite a bit. I like it. I think it's gonna be worthy of a mid rating across the board for both formats, for both limited and constructed. I'll give it a mid rating. I like Distorted Curiosity. I think it'll fit into several decks. Good card draw engine for when you need it. Our next card is Font of Progress. For 1 blue, it's an artifact. And Font of Progress enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters on it. You can pay 3 and tap it, and target player mills X cards, where X is the number of oil counters on Font of Progress. Well, they can get pretty crazy. If you get a lot of oil counters on this thing, you can end up milling them out of the game and decking them. Yeah, I think I'll give it a mid rating for limited, and I think I'll go low for constructed. However, I have a feeling there is a strategy for milling your opponents in this format. You could also mill, let's see here, you can also mill yourself if you need to get things into your graveyard, so that could be an advantage as a engine for your decks if you're depending on using your graveyard as a resource. And I think in a dedicated mill deck, though, I think it'd probably be more of a mid rating for constructed than low. Limited, it just depends on how many oil counters you're going to be able to get onto that, and how big each time you activate the activated ability will be based on the number of oil counters you have. So I think I feel comfortable with the mid rating for limited and a low rating for constructed for now. Our next uncommon is Minor Misstep. For 1 blue, it's an instant. You can counter target spell with mana value 1 or less. Yeah, that's pretty solid. I think this card's going to see a ton of play in Legacy and Modern, and it can make some impact in Pioneer and Standard. I think it's going to be a little tougher in Limited, just due to the nature of the limited format and how most spells, usually castable spells, are going to be, or at least that are castable spells that are relevant, are going to be in the 3 mana slot, 2, 3, or 4 mana slot area. So that being said, I do like it for limited, but I think it's probably just a low rating for it. So I'll go low for low for limited, and for constructed, I'm actually going to make this a high rating for constructed, just due to the fact in the older Eternal formats, I think this will see a lot of play. So I think it's a solid card, and it does affect spells that can target spells with mana value 1 or less. So a lot of those 0 mana spells, this can target that, and then of course any of the 1 mana spells. So solid card for the older Eternal formats. Our next card is Reject Imperfection for 1 and 2 blue. It's an instant. Counter target spell. If that spell's mana value is 3 or less, proliferate. Yeah, it's a solid card. It's a hard counter for 3. It's your typical counter spell with some new ability attached to it. And the fact that it's a hard counter, it's kind of nice. And if most of the spells are in that 3 mana slot, I think it's solid. I'm going to give it a mid rating across the board for limited and constructed. I think it'll definitely help in any kind of proliferate style deck. And the fact that it's a hard counter, that's just more power to it. So we'll go mid across the board. Our next uncommon is Serum Snare for 1 and a blue. It's an instant. It says return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. If that permanent had mana value 3 or less, proliferate. So just like the previous card we reviewed, if the target has a mana value of 3 or less, it lets you proliferate. So yeah, proliferate is really showing up in abundance in the Phyrexia set. A little bit more than I thought it would be, which is cool. I like it. It's really going to let you expand the reach of oil and poison and any other kind of counters you use. So I'll also give this a mid rating for limited and constructed. I think it'll see some play, especially in decks that are going to be using the proliferate strategy. Next card is Tamio's Immobilizer for 3 and a blue. It's an artifact. Tamio's Immobilizer enters the battlefield with 4 oil counters on it. You can tap it to remove an oil counter from Tamio's Immobilizer and tap target artifact or creature. So it's a tapping artifact. However, it's limited in the number of oil counters you can use. I think this card would be better if it wasn't so expensive to cast. It's pretty much just a poor man's version of the Icy Manipulator, but it doesn't even target lands, so that's not even that great either. And you're limited by the number of oil counters, and it can only target artifacts or creatures. I'm going to give it a low rating for limited and for constructed. I think the big redeeming value for it is that it's an artifact, and it's a non-creature spell, so that can play into certain strategies that depend on artifact triggers and non-creature spells. But overall, unless you have a lot of a supply to a lot of oil counters, I just don't see it being one of the higher cards that you'd want to pick or use in your deck. So we'll go low across the board for limited and constructed. Next one is Tamio's Logbook for 2 and a blue. It's an artifact. You can pay 5 and a blue and tap it to draw a card. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each other artifact you control. So that last card we reviewed, the Immobilizer, that actually helps this card because this Tamio's Logbook essentially has affinity for artifacts by reducing the colorless requirements for the activated ability. So yeah, you're going to want to have a lot of artifacts for this card to really be able to get you the most for using it and drawing a card. Having a lot of mites will help you as well, and maybe having those since they're artifact creatures. So I like it. I'm going to give it a mid rating for limited. For constructed, I think I'll probably give it a low rating. There'll probably going to be some other stuff to use for constructed, but this actually might shine in a commander deck though, where you have a lot of mana rocks and card draw, other kinds of artifacts, equipment. This actually could be pretty decent and end up only costing you 1 blue to activate. So, but that being said, in the rest of the constructed formats, I don't see it being used that much. But I think we'll go mid for limited and low for constructed. Our next card, it's actually a reprint. Thrumming Bird for 1 and a blue. It's a creature, Phyrexian Bird Horror, a 1/1 power and toughness. It has flying, and whenever Thrumming Bird deals combat damage to a player, proliferate. Yeah, this is basically it's a reprint from Scars of Mirrodin, where this card originally premiered, and it was great back then. I think it's solid now. It fits into the proliferate strategy. It's a flyer, and I think it's pretty decent. I think I'm going to give it a... I feel comfortable giving it a mid rating across the board for both limited and constructed. Not sure how often you'll be able to keep it on the battlefield in limited to be able to have it deal its damage and then also proliferate. In constructed, it's going to be a lot harder for it because there are just better creatures roaming the skies, and they'll be able to block this or just outright use removal on it. So mid at best for constructed, and limited, it's kind of right on that line between mid and high, but I'm not quite wanting to give it the high rating yet, but it's pretty darn close. So we'll go mid across the board for Thrumming Bird. Our next uncommon is Transplant Theorist for 3 and a blue. It's an artifact creature, Phyrexian Artificer, 2/4 power and toughness. When Transplant Theorist or another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. You can pay 2 and put target card from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. That's pretty cool. This actually kind of lets you loot anytime you have an artifact enter the battlefield. That can happen a lot with your mites or any other kind of artifact. And then if you end up discarding a card that you really would like to get back at some point, you can use the 2 generic mana to activate its ability and put that card on the bottom of your library. I think this is actually a better 2/4 than probably the other common card we saw with the similar mana cost, with it had a higher toughness at 2/5. This one I think is just a little bit better in that sense. That being said, I think I'll give it a mid rating for limited, and constructed, probably just go with a low rating, just due to the fact that the card loses out on other cards that are better at that mana value. If this was a 3 mana value, this actually might be pretty solid to have in as a constructed card, but I don't think it'll see as much play in constructed as it will in limited. Next up is Trawler Drake for 2 and a blue. It's a creature, Phyrexian Drake. It has a 0/0 power and toughness, and it has flying. And it says Trawler Drake enters the battlefield with an oil counter on it. Trawler Drake gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on Trawler Drake. Yeah, this is solid. And with all those oil counters flying around that you're able to use, and maybe move around onto your creatures and stuff like that, this only gets better. For limited, I actually like it. I'm going to give it a high rating for limited. I think this could actually be a nice finisher for you. It enters the battlefield essentially as a 1/1, but if you're using non-creature spells, it'll grow quickly into a larger flyer, and if you have other abilities that you can use to put oil counters on it, it's just going to get bigger. For constructed, it's hard to say. I'm going to give it a low rating for constructed. I don't think this will see as much play in constructed as it will in limited. Maybe in commander, in a dedicated oil deck or proliferate deck, but actually it would have to be an oil deck because it's really not that great without oil. So yeah, I think we'll go low for constructed and we'll go high for limited. Our next uncommon is Unctus's Retrofitter for 2 and a blue. It's a creature, Phyrexian Artificer, has Toxic 1, and it says when Unctus's Retrofitter enters the battlefield, up to 1 target artifact you control becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness 4/4 for as long as Unctus's Retrofitter remains on the battlefield. So when it enters the battlefield, it pretty much turns something into a 4/4 base power and toughness. And it could target an artifact that is not a creature, so that's pretty good. For 3 mana, that's not bad. I actually like this. I'll give it a mid rating, but it's at the high end of the mid. I kind of want to give it mid-high, but probably just not quite there yet. And for constructed, I'll probably just go low. It's a little clunky for constructed, unless you're playing some kind of dedicated artifact deck. But it does have Toxic 1. That is a good redeeming value, but I think there might be some more dynamic things out there. I could be wrong, but for now, I think I'd probably just go mid for limited, low for constructed. Next uncommon is Watchful Blisterzoa for 4 and 2 blue. It's a creature, Phyrexian Jellyfish. Has 4/4 power and toughness, flying, and Watchful Blisterzoa enters the battlefield with an oil counter on it. And when Watchful Blisterzoa dies, draw cards equal to the number of oil counters on it. So right off the bat, it's a 4/4 flyer for 6, but if it dies, as long as it has an oil counter on it, you draw a card. So it'll replace itself. That's actually pretty nice. And if you're able to put other oil counters on it from other sources, you'll be able to draw that many more cards. I'm going to give it a mid rating for limited, and the same thing for constructed. I think it's pretty solid in that sense. Although it'll probably see more play in limited, but I'm sure there's some decks that'll find some good use for it in constructed. Probably Commander more so, but it's a pretty cool card. I love the artwork for it as well. So yeah, I feel comfortable giving it the mid rating for both formats. So now we're moving on to the rares. Our first rare is Blade of Shared Souls for 2 and a blue. It's an artifact equipment, and it says 4 Mirrodin. And this is the first 4 Mirrodin mechanic we've seen for blue, so I'll just read the rule text for it. And it says, when this equipment enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 red rebel creature token, then attach this to it. And its ability says, whenever Blade of Shared Souls becomes attached to a creature, for as long as Blade of Shared Souls remains attached to it, you may have that creature become a copy of another target creature you control. Not bad, that's pretty good. And it has an equip cost of 2. That's nice, it's rather inexpensive. That's pretty solid card. I mean, you throw down, becomes a copy of another creature you control. Like, I don't know if you throw down this card and you already are playing something like, I don't know, let's say the Titan of Industry or something like that, it becomes a copy of that. That's pretty good. You can make some pretty cool copies with it. I think it's one of the better equipments I've seen. I'm going to give it a high rating for both limited and constructed. I think it's cheap enough to cast and use and cheap enough to equip that it'll see some play in both formats for sure. So I think I like it. I'll give it a high rating for Blade of Shared Souls. Next card is Blue Sun's Twilight for X and 2 blue. It's a sorcery. Gain control of target creature with mana value X or less. If X is 5 or more, create a token that's a copy of that creature. Yeah, this is awesome. I actually like it so much that I'm going to give it an epic rating for limited. The fact that you can gain control of a creature with mana value X or less, and if that mana value is 5 or more, not only do you take that creature, you also create a token that's a copy of that creature, so you get 2 for 1. That's pretty decent. I think for constructed, we'll go high. It competes with other cards that take control of creatures, but it's pretty darn good. There's enough balance in constructed to keep it from being completely bomb-like that that'll kind of keep it from being an epic rated card. But other than that, though, it's something that I think is pretty solid. But in limited, that could be a game changer that just changes the face of the game. You might actually be losing in limited with no creatures on the battlefield and your opponent's breathing down your neck with a giant creature. And you happen to draw this, have enough mana to take their big creature and make a copy of it. All of a sudden, the tables have completely turned, and then you're the one getting ready to beat them down. So, yeah, I like it. Epic for limited and high for constructed. Encroaching Mycosynth is the next card for 3 and a blue. It's an artifact. Non-land permanents you control are artifacts in addition to their other types. The same is true for permanent spells you control and non-land permanent cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. Kind of rough. I could see this being used more in a standard, or not a standard, a constructed deck. For limited, it's going to be kind of tough to work with unless you're playing this would actually have to be a build-around card. And because of that, I think I'm going to go ahead and just give it a low rating for limited. However, that being said, I'll give it I'll give it a mid rating for constructed. I think it's a good utility card to use in constructed that might help you with your deck strategy. If you need all artifacts, you just throw this down and there you go. You have all your artifact cards. And anything, any kind of permanent spell you cast or non-land permanents that you own, they end up becoming artifacts that'll help you get your artifact triggers. So yeah, I like it more for constructed than for limited. Next up is Merciless Spelldancer for 1 and a blue. It's a creature, Phyrexian rogue, 2/1 power and toughness. Mercurial Spelldancer can't be blocked, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on Mercurial Spelldancer. Then it says, whenever Mercurial Spelldancer deals combat damage to a player, you may remove 2 oil counters from it. If you do, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. So it can't be blocked. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on it, and in order to copy the spell, you have to remove 2 oil counters. Not bad. That's pretty decent. It's a little fragile, but that could be useful. Yeah, I think I give it a mid rating for limited. You have to have a lot of non-creature spells to get the most use out of this, so it's possible you could do something like that in limited. For constructed, I think I'll probably do the same. It'll see play, but I don't think it's going to be abundant. It's not a card that I would ditch, but it's a card that I might actually consider. Might not necessarily make the cut all the time, but sometimes it will. So yeah, I think a mid rating for it for limited and constructed. Next one is Mind Splice Apparatus for 3 and a blue. It's an artifact. It has flash. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, put an oil counter on Mind Splice Apparatus. And it says instants and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each oil counter on Mind Splice Apparatus. Not bad. Once again, this actually has to be... You have to have a lot of instants and sorcery spells. So this is a Spells Matter card. And... you can flash it in at the end of your opponent's turn. That way, on your upkeep, you can get that oil counter that you need. And instants and sorcery spells will cost 1 less to cast for each oil counter on it. That's not bad. I think I'm going to give it a mid rating for limited. And I think I'll do the same for constructed, although it's pretty close to a high rating in constructed. It's just the fact that it costs 4 mana, and you're going to need to be playing some kind of dedicated artifact / instant sorcery spell deck to justify putting it in there. But I think this probably see the most play in Commander than any other constructed format. Limited, it's going to be depending on the type of sealed deck or draft deck you have, if it'll be useful or not, and if it makes a cut. So yeah, we'll go mid across the board for Mind Splice Apparatus. Next rare is Unctus Grand Metatect for 1 and 2 blue. The legendary artifact creature Phyrexian Vodalkin, 2/4 power and toughness. Other blue creatures you control have, whenever this creature becomes tapped, draw a card, then discard a card. And then other artifact creatures you control get +1/+1. And you can pay hybrid blue, or not hybrid blue, Phyrexian blue. Until end of turn, target creature you control becomes a blue artifact in addition to its other colors and types, activated only as a sorcery. And this is the first time we've seen the Phyrexian blue. And the rules text for that is Phyrexian blue can be paid with either blue mana or 2 life. So yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of like a artifact / blue lord. You can also spread around that ability to other creatures, giving them his static abilities. So that's pretty good. I like it for limited. I think I'm going to go ahead. We'll go mid for limited. I think the same thing for constructed. He's not overly powered. He does help you loot whenever a blue creature you control becomes tapped, and he does pump up artifact creatures you control. You're going to have to be playing some dedicated artifact creature stuff to get the most out of him. So, or have enough life or blue mana to spread around his ability to give them the bonus. But because of that, I think a mid rating is where I feel comfortable putting Unctus. Okay, we're in the home stretch now with the mythic rares, and our first mythic is Ichormoon Gauntlet for 2 and a blue. It's an artifact. It says planeswalkers you control have loyalty 0, proliferate, and then -12 loyalty. Take an extra turn after this one. That's pretty good. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, choose a counter on target permanent. Put an additional counter on that kind of that kind on that permanent. Wow, so it's kind of takes proliferate to a whole new level. Lets your planeswalkers have a 0 proliferate cost, or and if you get enough loyalty, you can -12 any of those planeswalkers to take an extra turn. And then with your non-creature spells, they trigger lets you choose a permanent and put an additional counter of that kind on that permanent. That's pretty solid. I like it quite a bit. I think I'm going to give it a high rating for limited. And I think I'll do the same thing for constructed. It's close. In the right type of deck, I guess it would be an epic card, but not quite world-shaking, but it can definitely make a difference. I think I feel comfortable, though, leaving it at high, but it's a definite high-end high. It's a solid card. I would definitely be trying it out in any kind of Planeswalker deck, for sure, and any kind of Proliferate deck, so this is a solid card. Our next card is Jace, the Perfected Mind, for 2 a blue and 1 Phyrexian blue. Legendary Planeswalker Jace, and it says completed. And the rules text for completed is the Phyrexian blue can be paid with 1 blue or 2 life. If life was paid, this Planeswalker enters the battlefield with 2 fewer loyalty counters. So full cost Jace would be 5 loyalty, and a completed Jace paying life, it would enter with 3 loyalty. And its +1 ability says until your next turn, up to 1 target creature gets -3/-0. That's solid. And then you can -2 loyalty to have target player mill 3 cards. Then if a graveyard has 20 or more cards in it, you draw 3 cards. Otherwise, you just draw 1 card. And you can -exit to have target player mills 3 times X cards. That's pretty powerful. And there's Jace. There's the power. There's the payoff for the mill strategy. So almost a twisted version of Jace the Mind Sculptor. So that's kind of interesting. Even the artwork is somewhat similar, but it's the completed version of him. Yeah, I like him. I think he's pretty solid. I'm going to give him. This could be a little conservative, but I'm going to give him a high rating across the board for limited and constructed. Not quite epic, but pretty darn close. He's going to shut down a creature for every turn if he wants to, and over time he's just going to mill you to death. And then ultimately he'll just mill you to death completely with the -X. So pretty solid card though. But I feel comfortable giving it the high rating for limited and constructed for Jace. Next card is Tekuthal, Inquiry Dominus for 2 and a blue. It's a legendary creature, Phyrexian Horror. Has flying. If you would proliferate twice instead. And you can pay 1 and 2 Phyrexian blue mana and remove 3 counters from among other artifacts, creatures, and or planeswalkers you control to put an indestructible counter on Tekuthal, Inquiry Dominus. 3/5 flyer. That's pretty solid. Yeah, I like this. I think this could get really out of control, and the requirements to make it indestructible aren't too bad because you just remove the 3 counters from among artifacts, creatures, or planeswalkers you control. That might be pretty easy to accomplish. I think I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give it an epic rating for both limited and constructed. I think this is a card that could make things get out of control, and it's the catalyst for the engine for proliferating. I mean, combined with the right types of proliferate cards, you could actually proliferate, normally proliferate just once. Instead, you proliferate twice, and then each time you proliferate from this triggered ability, you'd be able to proliferate 4 times. So it's kind of crazy for each. Yeah, so that could get pretty crazy. It's one of the better Dominus or Domini I've seen for this set so far. So I really like it. And if I get it in my limited card pool, I'll definitely be playing it. And I'd love to build some decks around it, and construct it. So it should be fun to try out. But yeah, I think it's worthy of the epic rating for both limited and constructed. So that'll do it for the blue cards. There's some pretty cool stuff in here. Blue's got a lot of cool stuff with proliferate, and a little bit of oil, a little bit of toxic, but just a ton of stuff with proliferate, and a lot of artifact triggers too. So that'll be something to try out once the rest of the set is revealed, and being able to play it and try it out. Should be fun for the pre-release coming up. But I think that'll do it for this particular video. If you liked watching the video, you can subscribe to my channel, MTG Rogue Players, on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button, hit the like button if you like the video, leave a comment if you like, and you'll get notified when I post new videos if you subscribe. Always stay up to date on my newest content. But I think that'll do it here. Thanks for watching, everybody. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you soon.